Welcome to this episode of the Biology of Trauma podcast. I am your host, Dr. Aimie. In this episode, we're answering the question, how does unresolved trauma disrupt our sleep and what can we do about it? I'm excited to welcome Dr. Michael Breus to this episode. He's a double board certified clinical psychologist and clinical sleep specialist, and actually one of the few psychologists who have passed the sleep medicine boards without attending medical school. We will be discussing the profound effects of trauma on sleep through ways not often even known by professionals. We're going to be exploring how our nervous system processes life and life experiences through our sleep, and the practical solutions for overcoming sleep issues related to trauma. In this episode, we're going to go into the common modern stressors that can trigger trauma responses and unknowingly disrupt sleep, the importance of a felt sense of safety for falling asleep, the link between the freeze response, escapism, and sleep, and how to stop numbing in order to sleep, how to discover your chronotype and improve your sleep cycle based on that, how nightmares prevent emotional processing, and how dream therapy can help us walk through trauma, how trauma can make us feel wired and tired, and then finally practical strategies for better sleep, including a specific breathing technique and a specific journaling technique. Let's get started and uncover this trauma sleep cycle disrupting our restorative sleep and what we can do about it. Tell me about trauma and sleep, and tell me what you have seen in your own practice in regards to trauma and sleep.
So there's lots of types of trauma, right? And you know, that's one of the things that's been interesting. You know, when you approached me to do this this kind of Q&A and kind of, you know, discuss this idea, I was kind of thrown off just a little bit because I'm like, wow, haven't thought about that in a while, but wow, it sure is prevalent and it sure is necessary. And it seems to be happening quite a bit right now. So I love the topic and I think it makes a tremendous amount of sense. And I'm glad you made me kind of start to rethink about this because there's all kinds of trauma. Quite frankly, I mean, just turning on the news for some people could be traumatic at this point, right?
Yes.
I mean, looking at the financial markets today, if you're a big investor in cryptocurrency, you are having some trauma right now, right? I mean, if you're trying to buy a home, you're probably having some trauma right now. And those are not the typical traumas that we might think of when we hear the word trauma. Historically, when I've heard the word trauma and it's had something to do with sleep, I've worked with victims of trauma. So somebody who has been raped or assaulted. I've worked with people who have had natural disasters occur, and that has changed their sleep patterns dramatically. It's actually quite fascinating, but it does seem to, at least in part, fall into an anxiety component as well as potentially an environmental one. And let me break those down for you. So one of the patients that I saw, tragically, she was repeatedly traumatized in her bedroom by a family member. And so she became phobic to sleep. Like she was afraid to sleep. And every time she entered into the bedroom, it would bring up all this tremendous anxiety. So she had terrible insomnia, couldn't sleep in a bedroom. She would sleep on a lazy boy chair out in the den. And she was kind of petrified even. And to be clear, her attacker had been long had been accused, he had been brought to justice, and he was not in a possibility of harming her. But the thoughts and the trauma of just the evening time when that trauma occurred brought back tremendous memories for her. Another case that a little bit different kind of trauma, actually an old friend of mine called me up about 9 months after 9/11. And he was like, I can't sleep. He's like, I can't stop thinking about it. I have friends who died in there, and that kind of trauma. And so that was a very interesting case where we really had to look at, and quite frankly, for some people who have that level of anxiety, sometimes a medication is actually required to help somebody sleep. And I want to be fair, I'm not a big fan of medications for sleep, right? But sometimes you have to do something to break that cycle of the said insomnia. In which case you could have, you know, a breakthrough and be able to sleep more and then be able to hopefully get on the other side and get rid of some of that medication. And then the third area that I've dealt with particularly has been concussion, right? So that's a kind of trauma. a big one. And so I've had people from motor vehicle accidents, professional sports injuries, things like that. Let me tell you something. You knock your head enough times, you ain't going to sleep the same way that you used to, right? And so there are all these different potential traumatic events that seem to be occurring on a regular basis. Oh, and by the way, there's this thing called the pandemic. I'm pretty sure that was traumatic to every single person on the earth, right? So like trauma is almost gotten to the point where it's an everyday part of what's going on. And that in and of itself is kind of scary, but I'm really glad we're talking about this. And I hope I've given some salient examples of things that might make sense to somebody about how your sleep might change post-trauma.
And what I love that you brought up was this connection around the traumas are in the past, and yet the effects of them on our sleep are still persisting.
Right.
And so, and whether that's our reaction to the news, whether that's our reaction to the financial market, whatever it is, like these things are triggering things from our past. They're not necessarily, they're patterns, they're cycles that are now in our nervous system. They're in our body. They've become our biology. And so that's why I think something can have happened in the past and yet it still be causing big problems for our sleep.
Yeah. I mean, look at the example of the fellow from 9/11. I mean, it had been 8 or 9 months since then. And he was, I mean, when we were in session, it was like it happened yesterday. You know, it's like, that's where it goes for some people. So yeah, while there are past traumatic events, I think that there are triggers and cues that can bring that emotion up for us. And then, quite frankly, it's really tough to fall asleep when you've got all this emotion, you know, bubbled to the surface from whatever the trigger might have been. And that's another thing that people don't necessarily think about. One of the things I learned, rather, is that sometimes the triggers aren't what you think they would be, right? And so, as an example, for this gentleman that I worked with 9/11, the anniversary of 9/11 was terrible for him, right? Like, because it just like we work all year and then boom, September hits and this guy's not going to sleep for 2 weeks, right? Because even though, right, you see what I'm saying? It was in the past. It's just very interesting to think how trauma continues to trigger at times. And so that's why I feel like we have to get those breaks. We have to have that therapeutic intervention, you know, and say to people like, okay, look, how can we start to process and work through the trauma? And that actually is involved in sleep as well, but on a different level, in the dream state. Many people don't know this, but dreaming is actually where we process a very large portion of our emotions. And so a nightmare turns out to be when you're in a dream and it becomes so traumatic and so scary, you wake up. What happens then, a lot of people don't know this, is it pushes the pause button on your ability to process those emotions because you're not in that dream environment anymore where you can process emotions so regularly and so easily. And so you get stuck, right? And so when I talk with trauma victims who have nightmares from the trauma, we just have to get them to push play during REM sleep again, right? And so I work with a dream therapist. Now, I want to be clear, dream therapy and dream interpretation are totally different things, okay? Interpretation is very little science. Dream therapy, I work with a PhD Jungian trained dream therapist. She knows her stuff. And she has taught me a lot about this. And what she's explained is that she creates a safe space for trauma victims to then experience that trauma with her and then allow them to process through that emotion. And then the sleep comes much more naturally afterwards. So in many cases, a lack of sleep or an inability to sleep is a sign or a signal that you got some work to do.
Yeah. And I have a question for you. So one of the things that happens in the 21-day journey, which is where I'm taking people gently into their nervous system, right? And we do a whole week first of just somatic exercises. So they're body-based exercises that build on creating a sense of safety for yourself. The whole second week is building a sense of support for yourself, for your body, so that you actually feel supported, not telling yourself that you're supported, but actually feeling it in your body. And what consistently happens, Dr. Breus, is that people come back because we meet every day during this 21 days, and they're telling me like, I'm having more dreams.
Yes.
I don't know if this is related to the course, but I'm having more dreams. And I'm like, yes, this is related. Can you explain that for them? Why would this bring up more dreams when we're gently going into these places in their body?
Yep. So what's interesting about that is we have a tendency to dream about whatever is current in our lives. And so if I was taking a 21-day course where I was looking at all of these things, this would be information that would be in the front of my prefrontal cortex, especially as I'm falling asleep. And so that dream content is going to do two things. Number one, it's going to help me process what I've learned, like the methodologies and things like that. But it's secondarily going to help me process the emotions underneath that, which is equally as important. So it's really kind of interesting when you start to think about sort of how your dream work can actually be effective.
Mm-hmm. The other thing that I hear a lot of people talking about is that when they are falling asleep, that's when they have all this emotional stuff come up. We eventually get around to the right, that we eventually get around to the fact, like, well, you're busy all day long, so you're probably not even giving yourself space. You're silencing everything, and that's the moment that there's nothing going on, and so it starts to rise to the surface.
Yeah, you 100% nailed it. This is what I tell people all the time. Like, the reason that you get flooded with all of these worrisome thoughts as you're falling asleep is because it's the only time of day nobody's talking to you. Right? Like, you don't have any kids tugging at you saying, hey, I need this, or, your boss saying this, or your spouse saying that. And so here's what happens is you finally sit there, you just breathe, and then you're like, oh crap, whoosh. It all just comes flying in, right?
Yep.
And so,
I feel lonely. I feel sad. I feel the grief. I feel this. I don't want to feel it.
Right. And you're exhausted.
Exhausted.
Right? Because your days are exhausting when you're that stressed. And so you have this, what I call this wired and tired feeling, right? You're physically exhausted. Your brain is going 10,000 miles an hour, and you're just like, stop. I just want it to stop, right? Mm-hmm. And this is where things can get a little difficult for some trauma people, right? So some trauma people, they get so wrapped up in it, they get lonely, they get isolated, they walk down a somewhat dark path. Right. And that's really, we don't want people to go there. So if there's anybody listening who feels like that is happening, connect with us and we can find resources for you for sure. That's never a problem. Right. But also there's this idea that you're supposed to be able to take all that stuff and compartmentalize it and just get rid of it all. I mean, come on, we're humans here, right? Like, I'm the sleep doctor. I have bad sleep. Something happens with my daughter, I'm going to be honest with you, I don't sleep so well. That's just how it is, right? That's how I think a lot of us are from that standpoint. So don't give yourself a hard time for saying, oh crap, I'm thinking about all the things I don't want to think about before bed. That's a pretty normal occurrence. I do have a solution, however, that people can use. This might be a tool that you've used with people before, but it's called a worry journal. So what I do is I have them take a piece of paper. It's real simple. Draw a line down the center and just put all of those crazy thoughts that are flying into your head on one side. And then on the other side, you put one step in the direction of solving the problem. You don't create all the steps and you don't solve the whole problem. But what you do is you lower your anxiety because you're like, okay, Johnny's not doing well at school. I just wrote on my list, when I wake up in the morning at 8:30, email teacher to get a conference. Now, you haven't solved any problem, but you have taken a step in a direction to solve the problem, which lowers that fight or flight, lowers that cortisol, and then helps get you relaxing. There are a couple of metrics that are important for people to know in order to get to sleep if they're having these kind of issues. The biggest one is you need a heart rate of about 60 or below in order to enter into a state of unconsciousness. Here's the thing. If you're sitting there hemming and hawing about all the dumb things you did all day and all the bad stuff that's happening to you, I can almost assure you that your heart rate is above 60. So my favorite technique, and I know this sounds simple, but it's something that you can put into your tool chest, is 4-7-8 breathing. You guys are familiar with that. So this was a technique developed by Dr. Andrew Weil for, believe it or not, Navy snipers. Okay. So this is kind of a crazy, we're using this for meditation, but it's kind of cool. So if you're a sniper and you've got your target sighted, if your heart rate is above 60, you can actually change the trajectory of the bullet because your heart is beating. So those guys and gals really have to be concentrated, really have to be calm. So we use that same technique in the middle of the night to help lower that heart rate and it makes you think about something else, which is kind of a nice distraction technique as well. And so doing things, whatever you need to do to lower that heart rate, I think that is an advisable technique. Now, one question that you might ask, or that a lot of people do ask is, so Dr. Breus, what do you think about television to fall asleep to?
Okay. I was going to say that because I walk through the hospital, especially on the addiction detox unit where I work. And it's like half of the people at least are falling asleep with the TV on. And they tell me that they can't fall asleep without the TV on.
That's right. So it's a distraction technique. So when you're in the hospital, there's not a lot to think about other than the fact that I'm in the freaking hospital and this stinks, right? So we're doing anything we can to distract ourselves from that. Now, I'm going to talk out of both sides of my mouth on this one topic, okay? So number one, my wife falls asleep with the television on every single night, and I'm the sleep doctor, okay? I'm just letting you know how it works. Like I'm a real guy. We're talking about real scenarios here, right? And here's the deal: is she uses it as a distraction tool because she can't turn off of her brain. Here's the good news: 99% of televisions have timers built into the software. If you don't know how to use it, ask your kid or your grandchild. I asked my child; he told me exactly how to do it. And so now she falls asleep with the TV on. I happen to stay up a little bit later than she does anyway. The TV can naturally go off, and then I can go in and be able to fall asleep. Now, that's one way to do it. Here's where I'm talking out of the other side of my mouth. About 4 months ago, a really interesting study came out looking at light on during sleep. So if you have a light presence, a light source that is on, we're not even talking audio now, we're just talking light. If you have over 100, I think it was 100 lumens of light going, it actually raises your heart rate and keeps you out of REM sleep. So the thing to think about here is it's okay if you need something to distract you. It'd be better if it was like a podcast, right? Or something like that. But if you got to watch the TV, please, please, please use the timer. And for a podcast, by the way, there are these things called pillow speakers. People have no idea about them, but they work like a charm. And then you're not disrupting your bed partner. And then you can listen to something hopefully pretty boring, because that's really like, do yourself a favor. You don't want to listen to like, oh my gosh, I can't wait to see the last episode of Housewives of the Potomac. Okay. Like really don't fall asleep to that, because you're never going to fall asleep. Oh, and one more thing, do me a favor. You got to put this away, the telephone. Okay. Now I get it. The blue light source, I understand how all that works. It's not even about the blue light. It's about the engagement, right? If you're trying to get your high score on Candy Crush, you ain't trying to go to bed, right? So it's okay to be able to give yourself some space, some runway to land the plane to go to bed. It's okay to have some thoughts, creating your worry list. Me personally, I like to do a gratitude list before bed. That's really it kind of changes the channel in my head to allow me, because sometimes I can't stop thinking about things that might have happened to me in my life or my children or things like that. And so sometimes I just say, you know what? I'm going to stop thinking about that for 5 minutes, and I'm just going to allow myself to only think about things that I'm grateful for. And sometimes it's just a roof and food and family, and that's great things to be grateful for. And sometimes there's tremendous abundance in all of our lives. So I think replacing that negative, ruminative thinking, which we know elevates anxiety, if we can move over to more of a gratitude, resilience, which we know lowers anxiety, I think that the ability is possible, and I think you can do it, and I think it helps.
You have just said so much, and I want to highlight one thing that you started with, because it's perfect in alignment with what I teach in the 21-day journey, where people are coming out of the freeze response, which is overwhelm, the trauma response, they're in shutdown, their breath is actually really shallow. And then when they're coming out of that, they come into the sympathetic state, because the nervous system reverse engineers that pathway. And when they land into that anxiety, I tell them that, your body's going to go right back into the overwhelm unless you move to action.
Right.
And so I love how on your sheet of paper, you're going to have them put down everything that's worrying them and an action step, right? And not the whole action step, but just what is their next best step? What action are they taking so that they can stay out of that overwhelmed place and be able to calm their system down because they're moving into action. Love that you highlighted that. Thank you. My Aura Ring tells me that my heart rate lowers to between 45 and 43 at night.
That's
Am
awesome.
I doing good? Am
You
I
are
okay?
doing amazing. I'm in the high 40s and I'm a crazy fitness guy. So you are crushing it, girl. You are crushing it.
Okay, good. And on those nights that I do have trouble sleeping, what I hear you saying is that you're giving me permission that it is okay that I am listening to those boring business books.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
I'm not listening to my novels. I'm listening to my boring business books.
Yeah.
And they put me right to sleep.
So here's what's interesting is half of my group, I have them do something like that, like a nonfiction boring thing. But the other half, but some people, they love those books and they get very reflective with those books, right? And so boring business, I'm down with, but self-growth, probably not right before bed. You know what I'm saying? Because you can stir up some stuff.
Yep.
I actually like fiction before bed because you can turn it off whenever you want.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Because for nonfiction, for me, I'm thinking about a concept that's being presented in the book, and then I'm thinking of an analogy of how to lock it into my brain. I can't do all that shit before bed. Are you kidding me? That's a mess.
That is true. And I do remember nights where as I'm falling to sleep, I'm like, oh, that's a good thought. I should remember to tell my team that. And then it's gone.
Out of there. Just completely gone.
I actually listened to the whole audiobook of Out of Eden as I was falling asleep, only on those nights that I have trouble sleeping, which is rare these days. But on those nights I have it. It took me several months because it's a long book. But you're right. Like the fiction, it didn't matter to me if I missed a section because I could just go back to it the next night. It was totally fine.
Yeah, it works really well when if reading is your thing like that.
Yeah.
Podcasts as well. Like I said, the pillow speakers work fantastic for that. Yeah. And then also just being meditative and contemplative, but being positive in your meditation and your contemplation, I think is also valuable. And let's not forget that a lot of people say their prayers before bed. Nothing wrong with doing that, or reading scripture, or if that's your thing. Again, what I try to educate people on is you need runway to land the plane.
Yep.
Right. So you just got to give yourself that space. So many people, here's what they do is they wait until their head is nodding.
I was going to say, they try to do the crash landing for sleep and then get frustrated when they can't fall asleep immediately.
Yeah, exactly. And so what happens is they're in front of the television, their head is nodding, head is on it. Okay, I got to go do this. They go, they get in bed, boom, wide awake. Right. So there's a couple of reasons why that occurs, but if people take one thing from our discussion today, hopefully they take many more because it feels like there's been a lot of good stuff going on here. But one thing from a sleep perspective is if you want to wake up at the same time every single morning. And if you can do it, base it on something called your chronotype. So Dr. Aimie and I have had many a discussion about chronotypes and what that means. You actually have a genetically predetermined sleep schedule locked inside your genes. Believe it or not, I can tell it from your 23andMe data or your Ancestry.com data. So it really is truly genetic. If you head on over to chronoquiz.com, that's my quiz, you can learn what your chronotype is. And then if you can figure out your swim lane is what I call it. Now, to be fair, I give you the numbers, so don't worry. You don't have to do a whole lot of figuring out when you take the quiz. But if you can follow that guideline, and notice I said just the wake up time, right? So there are going to be nights where you're going to have crappy sleep, and that's okay. But if you've gotten at least 5.5 hours, get out of bed, right? Start your day. Don't get into bed early. And that's another thing that I've noticed from a lot of my victims of trauma is sometimes they're like, I want this day over now.
I'm using sleep as an escape.
Yep. I'm going into the bedroom. It's 4:30 in the afternoon and it is crappy in my head. We're done. And they want to, and sometimes they'll take a sleeping pill or they'll bring a glass of wine to help, again, dull those senses. And then they'll just try to anesthetize themselves, basically. Right. And so we need to also address that as an issue as well, right? Remember, guys, sleep is a bodily function. It is not an escape mechanism, right? Now, if you do it right, it will help you in more ways than you can possibly imagine. from an emotional processing standpoint, from a physical processing standpoint. I mean, the list of benefits of sleep go on and on and on and on. But I do want to be clear in that many people, and by the way, this happens in phases. So what I have seen, depending upon the trauma, is sometimes in the early phases when people are not ready to deal with the trauma, they have a tendency to get in bed early and do those kind of things. Once you've started working through the trauma, that has a tendency to slow down a little bit, which is exactly kind of what we want from a psychological standpoint.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's exactly what I was talking about with the freeze response. That freeze response is you're looking for the escape.
Yep.
And then once you're actually ready to work with it, okay, now you're coming out of that freeze response. Your body is ready to deal with that. And there's one exercise in particular in the 21-day journey where I have them walk around their bedroom, touch everything, even look under their bed for those monsters that might be under the bed.
Right.
And even with that, like the body tends to orient to the room and it feels like it's seen everything. It's checked everything out. It drops down to a lower level in the body in terms of I feel safe. And sometimes that has been helpful for people coming out of trauma to be able to sleep better is that kind of exercise.
Well, so I'm really glad you brought up a topic that I forgot to bring up, which is safety, right? Because that's what it's all about for trauma, right? Is I'm going to put myself in the most vulnerable position I possibly can. I'm going to close my eyes. I'm going to go unconscious, right? I better feel safe.
Exactly.
Right. And so, and I don't think we can emphasize that enough. And so from an environmental perspective, from a security perspective, whatever you need to do to feel safe, that is going to be instrumental in your ability to fall and stay asleep.
Yes. Yeah.
Without question. And so like, as an example, I know we talked about the person who had the rape. What she ended up doing was buying a German Shepherd and having it trained. And that dog doesn't leave her side. And you know what? Now she feels safe. And now she can sleep better. So it's so okay. Beautiful. Isn't it awesome? Like it's amazing. Right. And so like when we think about these things, like we can utilize other modalities to help us, like having a security dog, right? Like who would have thought that a sleep doctor would say, hey, go get yourself a security dog, right? But those are the modalities that we can use. But I really appreciate safety because that really is, I think, the crux of what it comes down to for trauma victims, because there's only two reasons why you fall asleep. You feel safe or you're just exhausted. And 9 times out of 10, my trauma folks, they're just exhausted.
And I see that probably in a lot of people who wouldn't even think that they have trauma. They're just going through life. They don't realize that they have trauma. But when you're reaching that point of exhaustion at the end of every day, that is trauma. Like you're living from a trauma place every day.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. Yeah. It's fascinating when you start to really kind of think about it. I mean, honestly, it feels like life is kind of traumatic at this point.
It is.
You know, like, I mean, I think
this is why, like, this is a topic for everyone. Like, it's not,
it is.
Not
it's
just
incredible.
For those who think like, oh, I've had this big event that was traumatic. No, like everyday life now. Yeah. Everyday life brings up stuff from our past, brings up insecurities, brings up fears, brings up that overwhelm. Everyday life now is kind of putting trauma into our face. Thank you for tuning into this episode of the Biology of Trauma podcast. Remember, restorative sleep is worth a good fight. It will be hard, and it is worth your time and effort to get there. It is possible, and it all comes down to our nervous system, and we can learn the tools to support our nervous system. Speaking of which, one of those tools to support our nervous system for restorative sleep is magnesium. I will have the link in the show notes to the magnesium that I use at bedtime, one that is chelated and contains multiple types of magnesium. This one has 3 highly absorbable forms of magnesium that it will support my nervous system to relax and give me the best quality sleep. Magnesium is one of the most needed nutrients for our body in the millions of reactions happening inside our body every day. It is also one of the most common nutrient deficiencies. So taking magnesium during the day as well, not just at bedtime, might be something that you want to consider, again, to support your body. And as we go into sleep, needing to have those storage of magnesium filled up, the tank filled up in order for us to get restorative quality sleep. I will have the links in the show notes for the magnesium that I use during the day so that my tank can be full. If you resonated with the freeze response from this episode and want to know more, I've put together a guide on practical tips to support your body during a freeze response. This is something that I did not even know, had to learn that I had a freeze response and then had to learn what to do about it. This is not something that I was taught in my medical training, and I've put that guide together for you. It is called The Guide for the Chronic Freeze Response. It outlines simple and clear action steps that you can take to help your body come out of a functional freeze state. I'll have that link in the show notes. If you would like to listen to other podcasts related to sleep and trauma, you'll want to go find episodes 68, 82, and 28. Episode 68 is on struggling with sleep, how to regain those restful nights. Episode 82 was on the biological rhythms that we get to align ourselves with to help our bodies recover from trauma. One of those biological rhythms being our circadian rhythm. Finally, episode 28 is giving you more practical tips for better sleep to enhance your trauma work. If you could please take a minute to leave a review for this Biology of Trauma podcast. As you know, I am here to bring you practical, valuable information that will help you accelerate your trauma healing journey and give you the knowledge to help do so with your patients and clients, if that's you as well. Your reviews, your feedback are how I know how to improve this podcast and bring you more of what you do like and find valuable and helpful. I am your host, Dr. Aimie. Until next episode, lots of love.